However, as this expansion project takes place around the Western world, and hopefully other initiatives like it are conceived under the umbrella of the Abraham Union, we need to keep trying to fix the problem here, because it's too late to stop now, but do it in such a way that shares the load. The height of achievement in this regard would be to get participant nations to get involved militarily here, so our children would stop dying in their lonesome, taking a stand against barbarity. But what does that mean? Some 19-year-old Brit needs to catch a plane across the continent to fight savages? No, that is also unacceptable. The burden of fixing the problem in the Middle East should follow the same trajectory this monologue has taken thus far. Honest accountability. Look into yourself and your own surroundings and fix what's going wrong there. The same way we're hopefully able to look into Israel and criticize Zionism as unacceptable and destructive, the Muslims of the Arab world should do the same. Now, there are many people who would listen to that and laugh. It's hard to blame them, seeing as Islam has gone through lengths to prove people's beliefs that we're dealing with a religion of violence. Maybe it's just my blind optimism, but I'm sorry, I refuse to accept that. They're not all savages. That's a despicable, racist lie. And I find it tragic that so many still think so tribally. Dave Chappelle is a Muslim. Muhammad Ali was Muslim. Sure, there's savages among them, perhaps in higher proportion than any other religion, but that should not be used to condemn the innocent. It's not okay when it happens to us. It's not okay when it happens to them. This brings me to the last part of this vision. The peace tide. Outside of cleansing their own borders of enemies, making their nations hospitable for the Jews in the process, and receiving the boons of our industry, participant nations of the Abraham Union will vow to participate in the cultivation of temperance in the Middle East. Yes, this might mean, for those willing, sending more significant military aid to old Israel, but not for the purposes of fighting. The purpose of the military here, from that point onward, would be to support the moral factions within the Arab world, as Netanyahu's vision laid out, except at scales that may actually bring about meaningful change. See, I'm not an Islamic expert by any means, but on initial readings of the Jihad, it seems to be intended as something analogous to the Shaolin. All I could see was talks about looking inward to transcend materialistic pursuits and enlightening the ignorant and fighting only in self-defense. They're basically describing a monk. It's just a highly disciplined, faithful person. And there is an unquestionable majority of Muslims born and raised on the Quran who die insisting Islam is a religion of peace. And yet there's this faction, a relatively small one compared to the Muslim population at large, that makes no honest effort to discover the truth and simply conforms to whatever narrative depicts their violence against those they hate as self-defense, looking for justification to keep being a terrible person. They failed the first stage of the jihad, the sabr, or spiritual jihad, which strives to suppress the lesser self. In Palestine, the perpetrators of this failure are those who believe the occupation paradox. Their wrong view of Israel as an aggressor is an intellectual failure which reflects on their spirit. Surely, blind adherence to speakers of falsehoods is part of that lesser self, and hopefully frowned upon by Allah. You should endure the pains of nonconformity, even against your own culture, and exhibit fortitude patiently, like the Quran says, in a righteous quest to find the unbiased history. True Muslims should support Israel's right to exist and denounce the Arab conquest of the Levant. Technically speaking, if you're a purist, it's reasonable to conclude that the Palestinian aggressors are apostates for attacking the peaceful natives of a foreign country. By all accounts, they should denounce the concept of a Palestinian state as heresy. They don't have to go that far, but the least they can do is start debunking the lies that are being spread by their warmongers. That has to come from within, which was impossible in the past due to communication barriers. But with the rise of the internet, that might actually happen. Just getting some to listen to this monologue would go a long way. So let's start with the biggest one of them all, focusing specifically on Palestine, the occupation paradox. This lie that the Israelis just swooped down out of nowhere and conquered a land they had no connection to. It may have been petty and irresponsible for them to exercise their claim to the region. Maybe it was more about revenge and zeal than it was about righteousness. But the histories don't lie. We were here for 1,500 years before the birth of Jesus. The Jews are indigenous to Israel, before the name Palestine was even a thing. So, if the Nakba justifies the Palestinian resistance and turns it into a liberation movement, you must also admit that the Arab conquest of the Levant justifies the Nakba and turns it into a liberation event, which means the Palestinian resistance is in fact the occupation. That doesn't mean you exonerate Israel completely, even though the Jews didn't come here waging war against the offspring of those conquerors. They may not have started the fighting, but they did accept it by ignoring the local sentiment, misguided though it may have been. You can think of it like the Native Americans. If they came back to what's now the United States, technically speaking, they'd have a rightful claim to it, as they hold precedence. And if they built most of it, this holds true for Jews in Israel, that's an even stronger claim. And of course, they were here far longer, so that's triple the claim. But would you really blame Ashley and Josh, whose families have been there for 200 years now, if they get mad that the natives want the land back? The Palestinian claim is completely understandable. It's the second best claim to the region. But for the righteous among you, those who claim to be true Muslims, you must admit the full reality of the situation before God. Palestine is a gift, an act of mercy bestowed because the Jews forgave you for your people's conquest, knowing it was not the fault of those alive today. Just like the Indians would forgive Ashley and Josh if they took back the US. What's next on that list? Palestinians are oppressed by Zionists. That's another big one. Now, I live in Israel. I know the conditions here. Certainly, there's plenty of racism against Arabs. Nowhere near their hatred for us, but plenty nonetheless. They point to the fences and walls around Palestine as evidence of that. But Palestine is not besieged by racism. There may be a minority that wishes to imprison Palestine out of spite, but the majority supports that as a counter-terrorist measure. The divide is roughly equal to the number of people who support Israel for Jewish humanitarian reasons and the number who support it as the state of the chosen people. Those who think we're the chosen people might want to keep Palestine under siege whether or not they were dangerous, while the rest of us would support its liberation the second they stop bombing shit. There's no need to speculate about motives. Just look at the facts instead of cherry-picking statements and trying to depict a narrative that suits your view. There's a reason Palestinian flags are attributed to Hamas and Israeli flags are not attributed to racist Zionists, and it's not bias, it's the facts. Fanatics in Israel are fringe, they're the rogue actors I mentioned in the beginning, and the rule in Palestine. Fanaticism is the policy of their state. And what is it they say? The preposterous argument that terrorists would not exist if only there were better living conditions? Inexcusable. There's massive proportions of terrorists who choose terror because they're lied to, and you know it. Those people want war, and their warmongering is endangering the peaceful faction among you that I'm graciously standing up for, despite having absolutely no obligation to do that. You should fight that. Seriously, who in his right mind would ever want to liberate a state that's sworn to destroy you and has proven time and time again that it's hell-bent on actually doing that. That's proven by the fact that there are 0 Jews among you, or in most Muslim countries. They are the racists, and it couldn't be any clearer. Palestine is not besieged by racism. Palestine is besieged by counter-terrorism. End terrorism, stop housing war criminals with pride, and watch the walls around it go down within the calendar year. As to accusations of excessive force within the IDF, yes, that's very true. A child could throw a rock at a military base and get his head sniped off from a mile away. It's obviously extremely cruel, but from your perspective, you must also admit that most acts of excessive force are committed due to self-prioritization. Not this one, but most. No country on earth would prioritize inhabitants of an enemy state, innocent or otherwise, at the expense of their own people, especially with this Jewish humanitarian strand making it so we really value each other's lives. That child may not pose a threat. There's serious improvements to be had, but it's not one-sided. Sympathize with the reason why they act with excessive force, like the cops in American ghettos. That may be what Jesus meant when he said you should love your enemies. Doesn't mean you agree with their goals, but at least empathize with their motives so you can communicate with them. I believe the conscience is the voice of God, and if you truly lend your ear to it, you will hear it say exactly what I'm saying, word for word. Fix the root of this problem. Our problem is Zionism. Your problem is the Jihad. Understand that they're not Muslims, they are aggressors, and they're causing more damage to Muslims than any other force in the world combined. There isn't a single justification for the constant sacrifice of human life other than the saving of more, and they proudly worship death. It is your sacred duty to combat that. And to whatever extent the Zionists solicit terrorism to justify their claim to a greater Israel, they should be punished severely. But that's up to us. You focus on the jihad. When you succeed, and all of this is in the past, Palestine will be free. Then you can finally have your own state and build a culture. It won't be from the river to the sea, but it will be free. And the path to a free Palestine will be paved on the graves of terrorists. You can call this distinction the difference between paleo-jihad, which is the violent, imperial, heretical interpretation, and neo-jihad, the faction of peacekeepers. They would collaborate with every person of virtue, Muslim or otherwise, in actually moving this region forward. And we're not going to tell you how to do that, whether you choose to imprison them, execute them, deport them. That's up to your moral judgment. All we ask is that you be a proper state. Persecute your goddamn criminals. Why would you expect to be free when you don't even have prisons? Where are your police forces? Where are your courts? Where is your army? You don't have to be a Western country, just be a country. That's what the world needs to uniformly demand from the Arabs. We don't need to give them democracy. We don't need to give them capitalism. We don't need to give them feminism, and we don't need to give them pride. They are sovereign nations, and they can figure out their path to enlightenment without interference. 90% of them believe in Sharia law anyway, so there's no point in even trying. You don't want to come in with this attitude and make people think their culture is being supplanted. The Arab world will not be westernized, and it's not clear that it even should be. Let them live. Even if the regime is evil, it's not right for us to sacrifice our interests for them. We need one thing from the Arab world. Don't infringe on our way of life. That means you don't import Sharia law to the West, and either imprison or execute your criminals so they don't threaten us. And with this framework, that goal may actually be attainable. Under this scenario, the Arab nations who've managed to bring about the peace tide would join the Abraham Union, and there could finally be an end to this ceaseless slaughter between the people of the book. I believe that's doable. Yes, 90% of Muslims support some form of Sharia law, but that same proportion can be trusted to also oppose terrorism eventually. The two are not the same. Sharia law is a way of life, a set of highly conservative values, while jihad, I'll call it paleo jihad from now on, or terrorism, is in total contradiction of those values. And it is Islamophobic to conflate the two, in my understanding. Hey, you know what? If I'm wrong, and this never happens, and Islam does turn out to be a religion of violence because Muhammad married a 6-year-old and yada, 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 then with all due respect, they can go fuck themselves. They'll be the ones who will suffer most in this godforsaken desert. Enjoy the decapitations. I doubt that would happen, given the comprehensive incentive structure being offered. That includes a religious appeal and economic developments the Arab world wouldn't be able to get anywhere else. But if it does, so be it. We'll be doing backflips off of yacht decks in Miami and skiing in the Alps. Obama says the problem is Israel is too strong compared to Palestine to make it concede anything. But Obama is a Marxist. He thinks every powerful entity is a tyrant. But that only applies in corrupt societies. In thriving societies, the powerful can be fair. Every country has a bit of both, but in Western culture, the majority of successful people are justified in their status. They really are better people. And we will prove that by showing generosity and offering you aid in mutual interest, so long as you play your part. What we won't do is continue to get exploited and carry your primitive cultures out of the 7th century at the expense of our welfare and global stability. That is off the table moving forward. We would include you in trade and invest in your countries, and in return, you outlaw terrorism and any form of terror denial, just like Germany outlawed Holocaust denial. Terrorism is the Arab world's national trauma, and it's time for you to move past it. Encouraging true Muslims to differentiate themselves from the terrorists with the aid of meaningful world powers is the best way to do that, in my view. Now, this brings up a different question. Isn't this project at risk of actually causing World War III? That's a valid question. Enemies of the West might look at such a move and be alarmed at the shifting power structure. For that reason, we'd ensure every risky move is enacted from a position of strength. As I said, this is a vision, not a plan, and it could take decades to manifest. And from the perspective of us Jews, if it does succeed, then we'll have this place as a backup without being restricted to it. Until then, this whole region should be renamed Zion and Jihad, being the two states of Old Israel and Palestine. It will be an absolute nightmare for anyone who stays here, but that's nothing new. And that's all I have to say on the matter. I don't see any way of losing here. The way things stand, our vulnerability is too high to constrain ourselves to a region that's this unstable at a time where the tip of the scales is that near. And if we don't, everybody wins. So why the hell not? We minimize our dependence on Arab states, get our Western allies to participate more heavily, improve their countries, look after our loved ones, potentially save hundreds of thousands or millions of lives, and maybe rid the world of terrorism once and for all. Not to mention, reduce the possibility of World War III as much as we can manage. It is time for us to have a proper haven, and now is the perfect setting to start building it.